This is one of my favorite scenes in all of Star Wars. And before we dig too far in, I need to really give you this very strongly held opinion. And that is that we're talking about a movie that was out in 1980. So there can be no spoilers based on anything I'm talking about here. So if you don't know these things, I'm sorry. But I'm also Canadian, so hence my apology right away. This scene takes place on a planet called Dagobah. And this is where Luke is in his quest to become a Jedi. He's just come off of, he's on a real high because he just blew up the Death Star. And he's now like, I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go be a Jedi. I gotta go find this Yoda character. And he is sitting with Yoda, and this scene, as it plays out, he actually realizes, he's looked at this green character and doesn't realize who it is, and he's like, just take me to Yoda, just take me to Yoda. And so he comes into the hut, and he doesn't realize that this is actually Yoda. And so this scene, young, brash Luke Skywalker understands suddenly in the middle of this scene that this is actually Yoda, that he's completely underestimated him. And I'm going to show you this scene, and there's all kinds of meta messages in here as well that you can think of in terms of accessibility. But let's start with this scene, and then we're going to unpack it a little bit and look at it in a few different lights.
I cannot teach him. The boy has no patience.
He will learn patience.
Much anger in him. Like his father.
Was I any different when you taught me?
He is not ready.
Yoda. I am ready. Ben, I can be a Jedi. Ben, tell him I'm ready.
Ready, are you? What knows you ready? For 800 years have I trained Jedi. My own counsel will I keep one who is to be trained. A Jedi must have the deepest commitment, the most serious mind. This one, a long time have I watched. All his life as he looked away to the future, to the horizon, never his mind on where he was, what he was doing. Adventure, excitement. A Jedi craves not these things. You are reckless.
So was I, if you remember.
He is too old. Yes, too old to begin the training.
But I've learned so much.
He finish what he begins.
I won't fail you. I'm not afraid.
You will be. You will be.
It's kind of like chilling at the end there. And this is always was one of my favorite scenes. But I had a completely new respect for this scene when I went to the Star Wars Identity exhibit. And I am absolutely a Star Wars fan. There are probably some of you out there that are bigger, more Star Wars nerdier fans than I am. And I'm totally down with that. So if you want to hang out and talk about this stuff after, let's do that. New respect for this scene when I went to the Star Wars Identity exhibit and I saw these. These are initial storyboard sketches of this very scene in Star Wars, in The Empire Strikes Back. And I love this, seeing the detail and the way that these were put together. So there's a whole lot of things to unpack here. And if you take a look, you see these really quick pencil sketches, and you can see the frames of the storyboard are kind of like drawn around it after the fact. So they kind of do this sketch, and then they're like, yeah, I think this is how we want to frame it. And you can see there's slightly different sizes, right, based on what the sketch looked like. And then if you take a look down the right-hand side, you'll see this is frame 13, 14, 15, 16, and you'll see down the side all of these notations and annotations about what the scene is supposed to be about. So we've got right here at the top, Luke trying to see Ben. I can be a Jedi. I'm ready, Ben. Ben. Dialogue. It goes from Yoda to Luke to Yoda, who ignores Luke but points at him. And then we go to Ben on the voiceover. If you take a look beside frame 13 and frame 14, you see on the very right-hand side, you see this little three-dimensional arrow that is drawn. That's like a notation for how the scene should play out in terms of the camera work. So if we keep looking down this right-hand side, you'll see all of these things. So we go from Ben voiceover to Yoda. A Jedi craves not these things. Yoda moves back to cooking. Luke, I have followed my feelings. Close on Yoda, you are reckless. Ben on the voiceover, he will learn. Yoda, he is too old to start the training. Luke scrambles back. All of the action is kind of mapped out in these storyboards. And it continues. I love this next one. There's some meaning here. And I know film from a consumption standpoint, but I've never produced a film except for like a grade 11 English project, but that doesn't really count. This storyboard, if you look at it, you see the big frame around the outside for number 17, but then there's like a smaller frame that's showing around Yoda's head, and kind of, so I'm assuming that there's some kind of like zoom action there, some kind of instruction to the production crew as to how this scene should kind of unfold. And we keep going down through the scene. We see all these sketches. We go through all the dialogue, and we end up with all of the details right into the point where we say the final frame is Yoda, go in close on eyes. You will be, you will be. Everything that we saw in that scene, in the production version, is represented in some way, shape, or form here. It's not exact. It's not every single word that was said. This is not the script. But this is the main blocking out of that scene and how that scene should play out. This is the stage where we get to make changes really quickly. We can try things out. We can say, hey, I think it should look like this. I think it should work like this. Now, if this isn't quite connecting yet to the work that we do on the web, think of the final movie as like the production version of the site, and this is like those initial storyboard sketches where we're showing the interactions and the things that we want to happen in this particular screen or on that interaction. There's a very different purpose for this than this. I also own several pieces of Star Wars art, and this is a painting of that same scene. So they created this production art, and they, I don't know if they still do it, but back in those days they did. They created these really wonderful pieces of art that were created by an artist, Ralph McQuarrie. He has incredible Star Wars art. There's lots of stuff that you can go out there and just see all these scenes from Star Wars that were painted by him before the movie was ever produced. And the idea with these was he's got a script, he's got some descriptions of the scenes, and he's going to take that and make it come to life in a completely different way. What he's got in this painting, there's nothing about the interaction. There's nothing about how things move or what the dialogue is or how the camera should work or any of the production notes. What this is like the highest fidelity that we have apart from the actual scene itself in the final produced version. This allows us to see color, it allows us to see texture, it allows us to see the surface of the walls, it allows us to see all of that. It allows us to see the direction that the costume designers need to take, the wardrobe designers need to take. It shows Luke's horrible 1980 hair. All of that is a different level of detail than we saw in the pencil sketches and a different level of detail than we saw in the final clip from the movie. This has a completely different purpose. Think of this as your like full comp, like the Photoshop pixel perfect sketch, whatever it is. We create things that look really rich and have all that color and that texture in it, but they don't do much for interaction. Now, the teams that we work with, we often see things like we're going straight to this comp, and then going straight to code without really considering or having that much discussion about what the interaction is going to be like. We've kind of, in some ways, skipped this phase. One of the things that is beautiful about this phase, about doing things in Pencil, is that we have not invested a lot into that interaction, into understanding how it works. We're really at a point where we haven't put a lot into the final production. This is really a quick way of us getting the basics blocked out and making sure that we know what's going to happen here from an interaction perspective, from a, how the interaction between the two characters is going to go, how the camera is going to go. There's notes in here on production, on the camera, for the camera crew, everything. So I hope that analogy makes sense for you. We're skipping this an awful lot these days, and that maybe has some impact, and I want to share some of those impacts with you from an accessibility perspective. We tend to look at this as a comp and this as almost like a wireframe, and we like to look at wireframes from an accessibility perspective because we can use that to predict and prevent accessibility problems before they ever even happen. So I love to dig in with this. Getting a good look at wireframes, or those storyboard sketches, really lets us understand what this interaction is going to be like, or what this interface is going to be like. And we can use that to make sure that accessibility issues don't get in there from the beginning. That is much, much better than going and trying to fix them after they're in production. After they're in production, we've invested a whole lot into them. So making changes is hard. When we're doing things and making adjustments at a storyboard level, we can have those conversations. We can have disagreements on, if you look on that scene number 13 with the arrow on the right-hand side, and somebody's got that in there, like, it needs to go this way, the camera, right? We need to pan to the right. And the director or somebody else might say, actually, no, I think it should be going to the left. We want to twist it that way for whatever reason. We can get that disagreement out then after we've invested in the shots, right? Same thing on the web. Same thing when we're designing there. I love the idea of annotated storyboards because what it really helps us do is, if we take this to a web context, if we annotate those storyboards with instructions or notes or direction, what we can do is get that disagreement out much sooner. And getting that disagreement between, say, a designer and a developer, and I know in your, like where you work, designers never disagree with developers, so this may not apply, but getting that disagreement out right away makes it much, much better because we don't have it getting into production and having that disagreement come out after somebody has invested like 30 hours in a comp and another 30 hours of code. We can have that disagreement after we've put in 2 hours of sketching. Right? So that, to me, is a really important piece of this. It's also very difficult to go back if we have something in there where in our storyboards where we can identify an accessibility issue there. We know that there's not, like, nobody signed off on storyboards, right? People sign off on comps and on things that have been tested and are in production. Making a change at the storyboard level not only costs less in terms of effort that goes into it, but it costs less in terms of political clout, right? If you try to change something in production and you go back and say, oh, well, we need to change this for accessibility reasons and it's in the final version, you are spending a lot of political capital to get that change made. So let's try to get as many of those changes to happen when we're still at the pencil and eraser stage. Right? It costs us much less politically to do that. These are the kinds of things that I like to think about and talk about when I say inclusive UX techniques for everyone. These are the kinds of things that we're trying to always identify. How can we make all of this stuff happen earlier in the process rather than when it gets to be too late? There's many clients try to deal with accessibility. They're like, hey, we're launching this thing in 2 weeks. Can you just take a quick look through and let us know how we're doing, right? That never ends well, never ends well. So we want to shift as much left as we can. This is the kind of stuff I spend my time thinking about. I'm Derek Featherstone. I'm Feather on Twitter. If you want to get in touch with me, you can email me, feather@levelaccess.com. I would love to talk about this kind of stuff with you. Also, even just Star Wars things, if you want to talk about that, I'm totally down with that. ultimately, people ask me, like, Derek, you talk about inclusive design a lot, and you talk about accessibility a lot. What's the difference between the two? The bottom line for me is that it's really this simple. Accessibility is an outcome, a thing that we measure. Inclusive design is a process, right? Accessibility is an outcome. Inclusive design is a process. We can achieve accessibility in a lot of different ways. Here's an example. I don't know if you remember this from about May of 2016. There was this thing with Whole Foods. And Whole Foods was kind of raked over the coals a little bit for having these pre-peeled oranges on the shelf. And the tweet reads, "If only nature would find a way to cover these oranges so we didn't need to waste so much plastic on them." Of course, much discussion ensued, and it seems like a pretty straightforward thing, but there was a lot of banter back and forth, arguing, if you will, of course, because it's the internet and somebody was wrong. So lots of back and forth. Ultimately, one of the people, a person with, I think, pretty severe arthritis kind of sort of raised her hand and said, "Hey, this is really good for me. I know it doesn't seem like it's good, but I can't peel an orange. So having that orange pre-peeled for me is actually really good from a disability perspective because my severe arthritis doesn't let me peel an orange, and I want my independence." Wow. One of the comments that ultimately came back was, and this was from a person with a disability herself, accessibility is nice and all, but that wasn't the thinking behind this product. It wasn't designed for disabled people. So we've achieved an outcome of accessibility, right? It is accessible, but it happened by accident, right? This is an example of something being accidentally accessible. There's lots of different ways that we can achieve accessibility. Inclusive design is a process that helps us reach that outcome predictably, consistently, sustainably. So we can make things accessible in lots of different ways. We can do it by accident. It just happened and we got lucky, right? We can make a thing that is not accessible and then we go back and retrofit it, right? It can still be accessible. We can also make a thing and have it not be accessible, and then we realize, wow, that's going to be a lot of work to retrofit it. Let's make an accessible version. Now, I don't condone or suggest that you use any of those strategies because I don't think they serve you well in the long run. But ultimately, all of those achieve accessibility as an outcome. Totally doable. Inclusive design helps us get there in a much more robust and sustainable way. So when I think of inclusive UX design, I think of it this way. It's the intentional facilitation and crafting of the interactions within an ecosystem that incorporates inclusion as a core value. I ask people about this all the time, like what words resonate in here. Some people, they talk about the words facilitation and craft because they see that that's part of what they do as a designer. And I love that. I think it's all valuable. Some people focus on the interactions or the word ecosystem, and all really important. Ecosystem is like all of the interactions of the ways that this thing that I'm building interact to make a whole experience. Very typical thing for service designers, for example, to think about when they're thinking about service blueprints and touch points. For me, the most important piece of this is the phrase core value. If we embrace inclusion as a core value, it means that we will not allow it to be deprioritized. We will not allow it to be pushed aside and dealt with later. There's talk with teams about this all the time, like, hey, can we just deal with accessibility stuff in phase 2, right? Can we get to that later? You all know what it means when you say, we'll do that later, right? And don't kid yourself. You know that it means we are not going to do that, right? We're not going to get there. It's not important right now. We'll get there later. Almost all the time, it ends up being completely deprioritized. But if we say that inclusion is a core value, that changes the game. Because if the organization is on board, and everybody knows, like, we're doing this, it's a core value, it's what we believe in as a company, you don't let it become deprioritized. When you let it become deprioritized, we end up with things like this, where we have a JIRA issue that was created February 8th, 2013, with a status of unresolved and a priority of major, but that is still like just out there, hanging out. This is 2,000 days ago. That's what happens when we deprioritize things. We don't want this to happen, right? We don't want this to happen. So if we make it a core value, it stays with us and it makes its way through the entire process. So I want to share with you some inclusive UX techniques that you can use to make sure that this stuff stays front and center, right? A big piece of it is mindset, but these are actual techniques that you can use all the time. And these are things for teams to do. So it's not specifically like, oh, this is just for developers or this is just for designers. This is for teams to do together. Number one thing is better communication. And the main reason for that is thinking about the design process. I loved Dan's little analogy of like the designers they dead drop their stuff. And then they're like, I'm out of here. And then the developer comes in and picks it up and they like never have to talk to one another. We need to talk to one another. And one of the best ways of doing this, I have found anyway, is building things in to the process where we have to find better ways of communication. So if you take a look at this as a wireframe, and think of it as that storyboard with all those annotations, instead of being a flat wireframe that shows the position of things, the relative size of things, the colors of things, what if we made things much more like this, where we have a layer of annotations over top of them, where we're specifying a rough order. This is the rough source order for this stuff that's on the page. Because there are lots of different orders that somebody could take here. If you were a developer and you got this as a wireframe or as a comp, you could take this and you could code it in lots of different ways. You could use Flexbox and Grid to move these things around, but we might want to have a very specific source order or focus order. So having these numbers there with annotations that go with them that say, hey, here's the order in which things should appear on the page. Right, so we start up in the nav, and then we move down to this little left-hand sidebar, and then when we go over to the right-hand side, let's make sure that we have the content first, and then that image second after that content, rather than the image first and the content second. Right? So we're going through and speccing that out, and making sure that we've got this really well blocked out so that we know roughly what order things should be in. And then we also have things like focus path notes. So hey, when you click on well, I'm not going to read that because it's hipster ipsum and it doesn't really mean anything, but number 8 is the video. So hey, when we click on the video, we need to move the focus here. And when we click on this piece of the interface, we need to move the focus here. And when they leave that, when they hit the escape key, the focus needs to go back to here. So we're really, really explicit. The reason that I love doing this with design teams is that we can go through all of that, we can hand that off and work with developers, and they will look at it and they will say, well, I think this is wrong. And I'm like, that's exactly the outcome that I want. It sounds counterintuitive, but that's exactly the outcome that I want. I want a designer and a developer to disagree about something so that they can figure out what the right way is, talk about it, and then make it a thing so that they say, this is the way that we're going to do it. We've actually talked about this for about 20 minutes, feeling really good about this. We're going to revise this. We're going to revise that. Let's make this the way that we do things from now on. P.S., this is a good candidate for making its way into our design system now. Right? So that's the kind of thing that we want. If we have everybody just happy all the time, like designer, hands off, the developer takes it, hey, this is great, awesome. There's no disagreement, there's no tension. We don't learn without that tension in many ways. So I'd like you to think about that. Use these as communication tools. Right? The value in this is really in the conversation itself, not just in those boxes that are on the screen. Its value is as a conversation tool. So keep that in mind. When we kind of skip that wireframing or that storyboarding phase. And I'm like, as I'm talking about this, I don't even like the phrase wireframing anymore. I think I want to just like, let's storyboard it, because that seems more rich to me and much more useful. So let's think about things as part of that conversation. That's where the value is. We also like to look at things and reverse engineer them. And sometimes we do have clients that go straight to code and without doing a lot of that sketching or having that conversation beforehand. This is an example of a page that was in production that we looked at, and we sort of said, hey, like there's some things on here that we can see that we know aren't really all that accessible. If you take a look at the color contrast in those, you've got the header across the top and the main content, and then the left-hand rail that has all of the navigation in it. And then if you look beside that, you'll see a green part of the sub-nav with white text on it. And we can look at that and say, that doesn't have enough color contrast on it, right? That's not good enough color contrast. We can see the green for mathematics in the very far right. We can see the mathematics is green, and we can see that's on blue. We know that that doesn't have enough color contrast. We need to look at the actual a comp or something in more detail to be able to tell that kind of stuff. But if we had looked at this as a wireframe, and we often deconstruct this stuff and build these wireframes backwards, if we had gotten to the point where we had seen this menu system at a wireframe level, which is going to be a nightmare from a keyboard perspective, let alone an accessibility perspective, if we had seen this, we would have looked at it and just said, no, right? We would have said no. If we skip the wireframing stage or that storyboarding stage, we lose a lot of opportunities. So sometimes with teams, we will actually use this and reverse engineer to see what would this have looked like as a wireframe? What could we have caught earlier, right? How could we address this earlier in our process? So I'd like you to think about that as well. It happens, we take existing things and reverse engineer them all the time. So if you look at this, this is from the Discovery Channel, the Deadliest Catch. You see the Deadliest Catch across the top there, all new dual survival. I don't even know what that means, but that sounds like a really interesting show. We've got this big sort of hero image. We've got this other thing off to the right, this sidebar content. We've got these two arrows, and we've got these two blocks down here. If we take a look at that as a wireframe, we look at that and we learn, like, we know generally what needs to be done. And if I make one small change, you have a completely different understanding of what we need to do from an accessibility perspective with this wireframe. So if you look at it here, we've got these two little blocks in the bottom right-hand corner. They're just blocks of content. So you're not necessarily planning for anything special. It's just a div with some stuff in it. But at the wireframe or storyboard level, if I change it to be something more like this, where we've got a little circle with a triangle in it, you now know that that is a video, and that brings to light a whole new set of requirements or things that we need to be taking into account from an accessibility perspective. Simply by adding or taking away those little round circles with triangles, we're communicating a whole lot of meaning. So going and reverse engineering these things helps you see opportunities for better discussion earlier on in the process. Doing that reverse engineering helps you have those conversations earlier. Does that make sense? There's other things that we see too. This is it was a responsive site, but this is effectively that same carousel, but on a mobile. And so here's the wireframe for that, right? It's a completely different setup, but we can also see very easily at this stage. One of the things that we typically do, if I bring this in here, you see we've got the main block and we've got the arrow and we've got the little dots in the right-hand corner. If we had seen this as a wireframe or as a storyboard, we would have immediately looked at this, or you may have looked at it and said, those dots need to be bigger. They're way too small and they're way too close together. We often think, especially if we're not thinking mobile first and designing for mobile and then getting bigger, if we're taking a large desktop site and saying, let's design the mobile experience now, we tend to shrink things down. For certain things, and you can see this at a wireframing or storyboarding kind of level, we can see the difference between this. We can see that, hey, maybe our content needs to get smaller, but our controls actually need to get bigger. The things that people are interacting with sometimes need to get bigger on mobile rather than smaller. All things that we could find earlier on in the process. So asking this question, how could we plan for this earlier, helps us in that reverse engineering phase. So if we use reverse engineering to go from something that's in production back to a wireframe or back to a storyboard, we get all kinds of insight on how we could have maybe solved these problems earlier in the process. Another tool that we use is interaction tables, and these have a pretty long history. This is very typical, and don't be like, I'm like, usually when I put this slide up, people are like, they're getting their cameras out and they're like, oh, I need that, right? Don't worry about the content that's in there. What you need from this is the concept of using this grid. So what we typically do, and this is, again, for a carousel, and I apologize for, like there's been 3 carousels already in this talk, and I'm going to try and avoid them, but I can't, because I always have to go here. Carousels are hard, right? That's why we don't want to do them anymore. But carousels, you can see here in this grid, we typically do things like, here's the state. Hey, I said no cameras. I'm kidding. You two take a photo. Here, let me. So we have the carousel state. We have the event that happened. We have what the interaction should be. We have the focus change that goes with it. And then maybe any notes about what the ARIA state should be, right? We're building this, and keep in mind with this, this is a few years old. And so there's things that we would probably do differently now. But the concept of the grid, putting together this interaction table, is useful for many reasons. I remember we started building this, and I don't know if you remember Bill Scott and the YUI library from Yahoo. So that YUI library had some really interesting things in it. This is a kind of a grid of interactions that Bill and his team had put together there. And it's called Interesting Moments. And this was an artifact that they created as part of the design process that said, here's these interesting things that happen in a drag and drop interaction. Right? So here's the visual things you need to do, here's the code level things you need to do, here's all of the important stuff excuse me, that make this interaction whole and that are part of it. And so I love that concept of kind of organizing things into this grid structure. It becomes really, really useful as a reference, whether you're looking at this YUI drag and drop interesting moments type grid, or whether you're looking at things in a more text-based format. This is interesting and useful not just as a reference, but part of this value is not just as a reference, but is also in doing that together. Designers, developers, testers, whomever, working together to create a thing like that, excuse me, that is valuable. This is that same conversation. If you think of the actual sketch storyboards and using those as communication tools, this is exactly the same thing. It's just in a text-based format, right? So we're talking about some really, very technical things, but getting these grids all mapped out as interaction tables is really, really useful tool. These are things that teams should be using together or doing together in order to make sure that they've got all of this stuff lined up so that the interfaces that you're ultimately designing and creating work really well for everybody. The other piece, and this is sort of at a team level thing that I'd love for you to be thinking about, is to simply practice inclusive design. Inclusive design really means that we are going to include people with disabilities in our process. And we've been doing that for many years with a lot of clients, even though they weren't sometimes ready for that. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. When we practice inclusive design, we are including people with disabilities as co-creators in the process. And we find out a lot of interesting things. One of the kind of baseline levels of inclusive design is to include people with disabilities in usability tests of the thing that you're creating. right? So you're creating a product. We do usability testing with people with disabilities. We find out all kinds of interesting stuff. When we practice inclusive design, there are things that we will find out from that process and from that usability testing and from those interviews. We will find out things that aren't yet codified in the accessibility standards that we have, in the technical standards. So that's why I say, when you practice inclusive design, that puts you ahead of the curve for things that will be standards later. The world of standards from an accessibility perspective has been really kind of interesting. The first version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines came out in 1999. The second version was 2008. And the version that we're on now, 2.1, 2018 when that came out. So that's a 9-year release and a 10-year release, right? That has a profound impact on the way that people in our profession view accessibility, right? I don't know of any other thing that we have ever done on the web that has a release schedule that long. It just doesn't happen, especially not today. So one of the things that has happened over time is that people have viewed accessibility as like, it's this static, fixed-in-time thing that does not change. That has a profound impact on the way that you approach accessibility. So what is happening now? And I'm really, really thankful for this from the W3C and the working groups that are putting hours and hours of effort into this. There is talk now of more regular releases. So we're on 2.1 now, and I'm making this up because I'm not on the working group. So I'm making this up, and as it's like hypothetical. But if 2.1 is now, maybe 2.2 is 18 months from now instead of another 8 years from now. And so we have these more regular iterative releases that will help people understand that, hey, this stuff changes over time. I'm going to give you an example. We did usability studies with people with different disabilities, and it helped us learn some things. In fact, one of the things that we see is that something that used to be seen as a nice-to-have thing is now in today's standard. So if you think about things that you find in usability studies with people with disabilities now, that might make it into 2.2 or 2.3 or 2.4. I'll give you an example of one. So in WCAG 2.1, we have this concept and a success criterion now, 1.4.11, for non-text contrast. We used to have a requirement, or we still have a requirement. We have a requirement that says all the text that you use has to meet minimum color contrast ratios. Right, so it's 4.5 to 1, it's 3 to 1 depending on the size of text and its font weight, whether it's bold or regular text. But the rules only used to just apply to text. So we would be doing usability testing and we would be working with, so this is an airline that we were working with, and one of the things that you can see is this large grid of choices for flights to go from one place to another. And in the middle of each one of those blocks of the grid is a price, but also a little radio button. And the radio buttons were custom designed to be part of their palette, but they were very low contrast. And so we knew this, and we looked at it, and when we were kind of looking at the comps and said, hey, these are low contrast, and these are probably going to be an issue. Sure enough, we do usability testing with people with low vision and people without low vision, and people had a really tough time seeing the low contrast radio buttons. It met their brand palette, but it wasn't really all that usable when they were in the real world trying to select something. In fact, many people looked at this and they didn't see it as a thing that they could click on. They just saw it as a grid of pricing. They didn't actually know how to click on it or what to do next, because if you can't see those little low contrast radio buttons, there's no affordance there to tell you you should click on this thing in order to move forward. So it looked just like a big grid of pricing. We knew that that was going to be the case, but working with clients is working with clients and their other providers. Particularly the people that kind of created this design, they at that point said, totally get that they don't have enough contrast. But that rule about contrast, that only applies to text, and these aren't text. right? We knew for sure, and they like, I get it, you're right. Those aren't text, but we know that that is going to be difficult for somebody to use, and we saw that bear itself out in usability testing. Now, this stuff is in the standard. We have that rule, 1.4.11, non-text contrast. Non-text items that are important to the interface, they need to have enough contrast too. This is an example of something that used to not be in the guidelines, but is now, that we can point to and say, hey, we were telling people this 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and now it's in the 2018 2.1 standard. It's not like it was accessible before and not accessible now. It's always been not accessible, but now we have a success criterion that we can point to and say, here's why, right? Here it is. So it's now in the technical standard, not just a thing that we find in usability testing. Here's another example. Character key shortcuts is a new thing that is in WCAG 2.1. 2.1.4, character key shortcuts. So if you're building an app that has single character key shortcuts, think something like Gmail, right? Many people use Gmail with like JK navigation and C for compose and the pound sign for delete and X to select. All of those are single character keyboard shortcuts that are really useful for power users. But one of the issues that you might find with that is that those character keys interfere with somebody's assistive technology, or somebody's assistive technology doesn't let you create that character key shortcut because the assistive technology intercepts it. So one of the pieces of guidance, and we've been seeing this in usability testing for many years and giving this advice to clients is, hey, if you're going to use these single character key shortcuts, totally fine, but you need to make them so that they can either be turned off or they can be customized or completely overridden. And that is now a thing that is in WCAG 2.1. So if you're building kind of like JK navigation into your app, you need to now build in some kind of a mechanism for those things to be overridable. Another one, WCAG 2.1, 2.5.3, label in the name. What does that even mean? So ultimately, I'll give you an example and then we'll come back to what it means. This is an interface that is abstracted and anonymized, but we were working with a bank and they were a top-notch accessibility team. They knew that this card interface, when they had a call to action in the bottom right-hand corner that says flip, they knew that when you flipped that over, they knew that the call to action, they didn't want to have 4 links that all said flip, right? 4 links that all say flip and don't have any kind of distinguishing features to them are kind of useless because the link says flip, and so if I'm tabbing through this with a screen reader, I hear link, flip, link, flip, link, flip, link, flip. I don't know which one I'm going to, right? So they knew that they needed to make it better, and so they did. What they ended up doing was, instead of having the name flip, or the text flip, be part of the call to action, underneath the link it said details for Ibura Sport Coupe, details for Romeo 3 Series, details for Milra 305S, details for Ibura 9 Sedan. So they gave it really meaningful link text. Details for car 1, car 2, car 3, car 4. It was actually for 4 different types of bank accounts. So they made that change. But what they didn't necessarily think about was that when they did that, the text now that is there visible, somebody that uses voice recognition software like Dragon Naturally Speaking, they will see what's on the screen and they will say it. So if they want to click one of these, they might say click flip, because that's the visible call to action. So they say click flip, but now the word flip isn't part of the links. And so now they have to do a little bit more work to actually flip that thing around. So the team was super smart. They looked at it and said, hey, we've got to make sure that this works for screen reader users. And then we kind of layered in another level. Like when we do usability testing, we see that that actually makes it a little bit harder for somebody using Dragon Naturally Speaking to use. So now we got to find a middle ground. And so what we ended up doing was something like this. Instead of it being flip, And instead of it being details for Iberosport Coupe, it ended up being something like flip to see details for Iberosport Coupe, right? So we're building in that word flip because that is the visible call to action. We're building that in to the link. So what does that have to do with this statement, label in name? The visible label of something on the screen needs to be part of the accessible name of that thing. So an accessible name is ultimately like a calculated thing that is done by the browsers and the assistive technology and their APIs to put all this together to say the accessible name for this link. So the accessible name for this link here is flip. The accessible name for this link is details for Iberosport Coupe. And the accessible name for this one is flip to see details for Iberosport Coupe. So at its base level, label in name means the visible call to action or the visible label of a thing needs to be part of the accessible name. And that's a thing that we've been seeing for many years, but was never like codified as a standard before. And now it's part of it. Again, it's not that it was accessible before and it's not now. It's really just our way of understanding accessibility has moved and progressed, so now we have some new success criterion about it. So ultimately, we want to make sure that we're designing with people with disabilities, not for people with disabilities. We need people with disabilities to be involved in the process. Right? We do that through usability testing. That's like baseline level way of doing it, usability testing with people with disabilities. And there's lots of other ways that we can include people as well, and we'll talk more about that later. Techniques that are specific to designers. When you are creating your color palettes, we often see things in design systems, and you may have seen examples like this earlier, like here's the primary background colors, the secondary background colors, the supporting neutral colors, etc. You'll see things blocked out. That's like, a baseline level, and one of the things that we see is those kind of reorganized to make sure that they're useful and they have the hex colors and the RGB values in there. But I am a big, big fan, and I would encourage you all to do this, to not stop there. It's not about the colors, but from an accessibility perspective, it's how the colors work together. So take one more step and do something like this. These are good combinations, this color with this color. These are combinations that we can use for large font only, this color with this color. And these are combinations that we should avoid. So the idea behind color contrast is for background and foreground color, you need to have a certain contrast in them so that it's readable by as many people as possible. The baseline that we've set is 4.5 to 1 for regular size type, or if it's a large font, it can be 3 to 1. So if you take a look here, and I'm a huge fan of doing this, you can see in each combination, not only have we used them in combination, but we've said, here's the contrast ratio between these two things, so that we start to socialize that, so that people know not just that, hey, these colors go together, they know that they go together because the math supports it. So 4.5 to 1, 3 to 1, and anything less than 3 to 1, we're going to avoid. So use this kind of thing in your design work. When you're building your design system, focus on not just color, but color combinations. And there's all kinds of tools out there that help you with this. But whatever tools you use, make sure that you put these things together and show not just good, but also bad combinations, things that we should be avoiding. For designers, we also need to communicate our design intent. So this was a slide to confirm transaction. When we were working with a bank on their mobile app, they wanted to do money transfers. And so one of the things that they used to have was, you accept and say, yes, I want to transfer this. And then it pops up a dialogue that says, are you sure this is not reversible? You have to, really be sure. And so you have to hit, yes, you want to do the transfer, and then you have to confirm it again. Excuse me. So one of the things that they were postulating, and Amazon does this with in their app, where you can actually slide across to confirm. It's seen as a more intentional way of confirming that, yes, you want to do this. tapping on something is that happens, like you can do that by accident. It's much more difficult to slide to confirm by accident, and it's a longer gesture, so it takes more to actually complete that gesture. So they knew what they were doing. They knew that if they slid across to confirm, they would put in a nice little piece of feedback, and they knew how to make this accessible to people with all kinds of different disabilities. So they knew that if they made this thing a button that could be activated, if somebody was using a screen reader, they could double tap on the screen, and that would activate the confirmation as well. So they knew how to do that. That was perfect. They even set it up so that if somebody was using a switch, so somebody that has mobility challenges, they might be using a switch. If you think of a switch, you know the big Staples easy button, right? It might look like one of those, but it's basically an input device that you can use to activate. And so one of the things that we can do is use that switch to move a cursor to a specific point on the screen and then say, do this thing. So they would, this is kind of like mocking it up, but ultimately what they could do is say, move the cursor to there and then drag the mouse cursor across, and that will work. So they've made that target nice and big so that it's easy to identify with that kind of crosshair mechanism. They even built it in so that somebody that could physically move that and slide it across, they built in a little bit of literally wiggle room for somebody that doesn't have the fine motor control to keep it right exactly within there, so that if you're sliding on something and you come off of it, it's going to release that and it's going to be like, oh, you didn't slide it. So they built in a little bit of wiggle room so that if somebody had some mobility or dexterity challenges, that would still work. Wonderful, wonderful work that they did, but one of the things that they needed to kind of think of a little bit differently was a very key piece of this. The whole purpose for sliding to confirm is that it's not an interaction or a thing that people do all the time, right? It's hard to do this by accident. It's very intentional, right? If we go back to this one, not this one, and we think about a screen reader user who is using a screen reader on that screen, double tapping is the way that they activate probably everything. And so there was the same level of intentionality of interaction wasn't there. So slide to confirm, I have to be really clear, that's the thing I want to do. But if I activate that on a double tap, that's like something that somebody that uses VoiceOver or TalkBack on an iOS or Android device, they do that all the time. And so the same intentionality for the design was not there. And so we can solve that by maybe, if VoiceOver or TalkBack is active, we maybe have a custom gesture. Maybe and I'm making this up, right? So maybe we set it up so that they have to literally print the word Y on the screen with their finger as a confirmation. Or maybe there's some other gesture where they need to they need to double tap or do some other gesture with multiple fingers or whatever it is, but something that reflects the intent of the design. So we need, as designers, to really clarify and communicate that design intent. We also need to think as designers about things like interface transformation. Here's our friend, the carousel again. But one of the things that I would love for you to think of as a designer, the next time you're designing a carousel, is to think, maybe this would be better as a list or as a grid, and allow a person to transform the interface so that instead of having to scroll through this 3 pages of 3 in a little carousel, they have the ability to tap on something in the interface that turns it into a list so that all of the items are there. For somebody with dexterity issues, scrolling through that carousel might be really, really challenging. And so just having a mechanism for them to expose all the options at once might be really, really useful. Same thing, instead of a list, maybe we just pop it out and make it a grid. So we're not paging through things. We've just got everything there, and it's much easier for them to tap on that control. On the developer side of things, I'd love for you to do some CSS class name review. look through the names that you have in your CSS classes, and then think about expressing those things in different ways. So if you have a class of current or class of active, one of the things that you will be able to do with this new feature in ARIA, this is not like really supported well yet, but keep in mind that this is coming. When you see a class of current, that should immediately get you to think, hey, I need to represent this programmatically, not just with a visual representation. So when you have class of current, you usually put like a different background color on it, or maybe a different border, or you might put a little icon beside it or something, right? So the ARIA current is a way of saying programmatically, this is the current thing. Really useful for people that can't see that CSS class that you've put on there. Same thing, class equals expanded or class equals collapsed. Look for ARIA expanded equals true or false. Build that in. So we sometimes work with teams to build these as rules into their linting process. So they are looking for those things and calling them out and saying, hey, we see that you've got a class of expanded and collapsed. You might want to add ARIA expanded equals true or ARIA expanded equals false to that interaction. And it's not a simple like take your CSS and do it in ARIA instead. You're still going to use the CSS. You just need to start thinking about the ARIA side of things as well. Same thing with a class of error. We've got a new thing in ARIA that is, again, not really well supported yet, but will be. ARIA error message equals the ID of the error message. This is a way of being really explicit on what the error message is for that form field. And then class equals hidden, ARIA hidden equals true or false. These are things that developers can do immediately to start making their code better so that you've got that built in, that inclusion built in. So look for things that are meaningful in your CSS and move it to another layer like HTML or ARIA. We make high contrast tweaks as developers. We're going to go through this one really quickly, but if you take a look here, this is the Bell Canada interface. And if you take a look in that top navigation, you can see Shop, Support, and My Bell. And they all have a little down arrow beside them. What does that down arrow tell you? If you click it, what's going to happen? Something is going to show up as a drop-down, right? So if I switch this into high contrast theme, and that background image disappears, this tells you a very different story. If you are magnified and looking at this and you see the arrow there, you are now looking for things in the same page. But if you see it like this and you click on it, you're expecting to load a new page. That little interface clue has an impact. So we need to make sure that that comes through when we're in a high contrast theme. If you take a look, even this very subtle, if you take a look around the little chat dialog there, you'll see there's like a little drop shadow kind of thing on there. When we flatten this interface and look at it in a high contrast theme, certain things disappear, and we're now at a point where because that drop shadow is gone, there's no depth to the interface, it's been flattened. We can't see, or it's harder to tell the difference between that as being a thing on top of the interface and the interface itself, right? And you can easily tweak that by putting a border around it. So we just need to make some high contrast tweaks, and I'm going to leave that with you. You can put a transparent border on something so that it doesn't visibly show, but when you switch into a high contrast theme, it will actually be able to be transformed by that interface. So look for things that are meaningful in your visual design and put those in HTML or in ARIA as well. When we work with gestures, we need to think about things. We've done things before where we've made a sortable table. So if you swipe down a table, it will actually sort that table on that column in an ascending or descending fashion based on the gesture that you use. Some people can't do that gesture. So what we build in is some other mechanism so that if you tap on the table header cell, if you tap on it, that automatically toggles it between ascending and descending. So think about those gestures that you're building into things these days. We might need alternatives for different ways of making that work. So we need to consider complementary methods to use with those gestures. The last technique is trying to find ways of avoiding black holes. And I'm not talking about like this other really horrible, cheesy 1970s sci-fi movie. This was not a great movie. You should go and watch it though anyway, because you can. I'm talking about things like keyboard black holes, and many carousels become keyboard black holes to people. And you see at the top here, this page 1 of 2. That is something that we call a really good idea. And there's part of the reason that that is a good idea is because it sets the stage for what's about to happen. Like, hey, there's 2 pages here. If I know that it's page 1 of 2, I'm like, maybe I'll go into that carousel. But if it's page 1 of 10, I might be like, I don't know if I want to go in there. Interesting thing happens though. How many items are in this carousel? If you can see, you can tell me how many items are in this carousel in total. You can shout it out too if you want to right now. There's 6 on the first page. If there's 2 pages, the math tells us that there's 12 items max in there. But if I can't see that there's 6 in there because I can't see the screen, page 1 of 2 is not necessarily that useful to me because it could be 2 pages of 100 each. So one of the things that we need to be thinking about is not just doing things like this, like page 1 of 2 is really good, but what we might want to do is say, customers who bought this item also bought, and there's 16 items, so that we know that it's a list of 16 or it's a list of 12 or whatever it is. So we build in more clues into the interface to let people know and set the expectation of what they're about to go into. Because if you're tabbing through a carousel, you could be going forever, right? We do a lot of work to think about how people get into things, and we want to help answer this question: what happens if I go into this thing? As developers and designers, we have a kind of an obligation to do this. So we just talked about how do we get into things. We need to look at this last example. I look at this ramp here. This is a pharmacy in Mexico, and I think it's well-intentioned. But if you look at this ramp is not like, this is a ramp that people use to like bring the dolly in, right? But this is not like a ramp for a wheelchair. This doesn't meet any accessibility standard ever, anywhere. Now, fortunately, if you're looking at it, the door does open in. If it opened out, we would be in a whole lot of trouble. The door opens in. The reason that I share this with you is not because of the ramp itself. There's some obvious things there, but I am scared for the person in a wheelchair that is trying to get out of the store, just as much as getting in. Because if you look at that ramp, it's steep and it's like a very short ride to being right in the middle of the road, right? So we put a lot of effort into this all the time. How do people start using the thing that I want them to use? But we don't put enough effort into how do people stop using the thing that we've got them using, right? So how do people get out of that carousel? If they can get in, how do they get out? They can get in to this store, how are they going to get out? So I want you to put that same level of thought and consideration into that as well. I hope that all makes sense to you. I hope that this distinction between these two really makes sense. Accessibility is an outcome, inclusive design is a process, and I would love for you very much to embrace that process. Thank you very much.